More on the White House statement, in part calling Bill Taylor a radical, unelected bureaucrat. Let's take a look at Taylor's career. He's a graduate of both West Point and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, who served for 6 years as an Army infantry officer, including with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam. He is among the country's most experienced diplomats, with a career that spans nearly 50 years, serving in every administration, Republican and Democrat, since President Ronald Reagan. He was appointed by President George W. Bush in 2006 to serve as ambassador to Ukraine, and served under both Bush and President Obama. After decades of service in government, Taylor left and was serving as the executive vice president of the United States Institute of Peace in Washington when he was called back after Marie Yovanovitch was ousted from her position as ambassador to Ukraine in May. And as Willie mentioned, he was recommended to Secretary Mike Pompeo for that role by Kurt Volker, the State Department's recently departed special envoy for Ukraine. Let's bring in national security expert, columnist at USA Today, and author of the book, The Death of Expertise, Tom Nichols. Tom, at this point, where are we in the Ukraine scandal, especially after the testimony by Ambassador Taylor?
Well, what's left now to find out? How many more times can we affirm that everything that we think happened is exactly what happened? The president wanted one of his political opponents investigated. He held up money that had been appropriated by the Congress of the United States for a specific purpose, and tried to shake down a foreign government to get what he needed for his political fortune. Clear abuse of power, clear elevating of the president's personal interest above the national interest, clearly endangering a friendly country, a partner, holding the line against Russia. I mean, at this point, how many more times can esteemed, respected, experienced diplomats come forward and tell us that exactly what we think happened is exactly what happened? I think I think the story's clear. I think at this point we're just going to get additional details that are just going to confirm what we already knew, and I think we are well into impeachable territory.
And David Ignatius, as you read this 15-page opening statement, this document, and we haven't even seen the question and answer session, he was in there for 9.5 hours yesterday. It's clear how experienced he is, first of all, and the level of detail that is in here speaks to his note-taking and his collection of documents, because he knew something wasn't right and he wanted to have a paper trail to explain in this very moment yesterday. But it does speak to, does it not, the sloppiness or the arrogance or some combination of this administration, of this shadow foreign policy, that they thought they could roll over Bill Taylor and he just wouldn't say anything. He'd go along for the ride. They learned yesterday, over almost 10 hours of testimony, he wouldn't.
He was there watching, obviously, the consummate professional, and as he realizes what's going on, he begins trying to say to people, stop this.
Yeah.
There's a text that he wrote to Gordon Sondland, who's the political appointee, who's the EU ambassador, part of the irregular channel, as Taylor puts it, that's really controlling policy. And he says it's crazy to condition our military assistance, $391 million in military assistance for an ally fighting Russia, on political favors. That's crazy. And he doesn't get an answer from Sondland. Later he writes directly to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He says, this policy that you're conducting is folly. That's the word. He speaks out. Quiet man, as we've seen, he speaks out and says, this is folly. One of the questions I have this morning is, where's Mike Pompeo?
Yes, that is a
the person
huge
he
question.
appointed to take this job, to oversee our diplomacy with Ukraine, a country involved in a deadly battle with Russia. Where's the guy who appointed him? Why doesn't he have anything to say?
Well, and David,
we're going to focus on that more and more.
Secretary of State Pompeo has kept, when he gets asked about this, he says, I'm not talking about hypotheticals. Yep. David Ignatius, this is not a hypothetical. The guy he appointed now has an incredible, detailed story of how this, quote, drug deal went down, so to speak. I mean, this is not a hypothetical. He has to answer questions at some point to the reality that happened on his watch, doesn't he?
So, Mika, I think this is Mike Pompeo's profile and courage moment. Either he steps up and tells the truth. He obviously has been concerned about this for months. That comes through. Or he does what he's so often done, retreats and waits for the president to make up his mind and tries to be loyal to Trump. Now, for Mike Pompeo, it's not going to be possible to do both. And I think there's going to be focus on him. What did he do? What did he say? What does he think now? Another
focus will be on Republicans who have been defending President Trump throughout all of this. Let's bring in MSNBC correspondent Garrett Haake. I wonder, Garrett, if you saw anything on Capitol Hill yesterday. You were there all day. Was there any initial reaction? And what are you expecting today?
Yeah, Mika, the reaction all day was so striking. First from Democrats coming out of the room looking shaken, as if they sort of have to go through with this now. This was not the testimony I think they were expecting, even from a star witness. And then throughout the course of the day, watching Republican talking point shift, attitude shift on this whole thing, I started to hear from more Republicans things like, well, could it have really been a quid pro quo if the Ukrainians didn't know why the aid was being withheld? Essentially moving the goalposts throughout the course of the day in response to what they had heard from Taylor. And then the White House statement was the capstone on all of this, going back into the Mueller bag of tricks and smearing their own foreign service officers. But we've been hearing more and more of this over the last several days. Republicans not trying to push back at all on the substance of what they're hearing in these closed-door depositions, but really just hammering the process. I mean, going right back to the Clinton impeachment playbook and just saying this is an unfair process. It's being done behind closed doors. It doesn't count, essentially, but not addressing the substance of this. And to me, the most interesting underplayed soundbite all day yesterday was Mitch McConnell being asked to comment on this and being read essentially that tweet from Donald Trump saying, oh, Mitch McConnell said this was a perfect phone call. And McConnell saying, I don't remember having any conversation with the president about this. I mean, you are seeing Republicans back away from this, not knowing how to respond, and clearly very uncomfortable following the White House's lead in smearing career foreign service officers. I'll be very curious to see if the Jim Jordans and Mark Meadows and other more reliable defenders of the president come to play today with a new defense here, or if they follow the White House's lead and go that route.
Well, Garrett, you anticipated my question, which was the approach that some of these Republicans are taking. It seems to be about process. They didn't want to talk about the content of Bill Taylor's testimony in his opening statement that the public all saw. But Steve Scalise, for example, the minority whip in the House, who's been a defender of President Trump, was out retweeting members, clearly a concerted effort, saying the impeachment process literally being conducted in the basement behind closed doors to keep you, the people, from seeing what's happened. They even have a hashtag and everything else. The argument seems to be this is happening in secret, except there are Republicans in the room. Could you explain what the hearings look like?
Sure. These do happen in a secure room downstairs. It's a small room. When Congress is back, when all three committee members, the three committees that are doing this, when these folks could all be in the room, it becomes a standing room only situation. So a lot of members come in and out throughout the course of the day. And yes, staff conducts the majority of these interviews, but members are allowed to ask questions, Republican and Democratic members. And based on the rules of this, members are not supposed to come out and talk to us very much about what they're seeing and hearing in the room. But of course, this is Congress. Everybody talks about everything. So we get little bits and pieces of what's going on in the room. If there were leaks that were beneficial to the president's argument, we would hear those as well. I talk to just as many Republican members as I do Democratic members on most days. And we are not hearing leaks of favorable information from the Republicans who sit in these rooms day after day. We are hearing these process complaints. And look, there may be some political value to that. This is a tried and true tactic. It worked for Bill Clinton's defenders 20 years ago to say the process is unfair, this is overzealous, and to point, at least for the Republican base, towards a bunch of figures who they have been trained to hate. Adam Schiff and the deep state and all these actors who they see as on this never-ending quest to get President Trump. But there has been no factual counter-narrative presented about why what the president did or didn't do is okay. That has not emerged at all from these rooms or from the Republicans who sit in them all day.
Garrett Haake, thank you so much. What a day on Capitol Hill. And of course, we saw the president true to form yesterday. Often when things get really bad and information appears to really put him in a terrible position, he loves to distract with just a little dose of racism for the country. And his tweet using the totally terrible and inappropriate word lynching drew a lot of reaction. And then people were bringing up other times that people very inappropriately use the word. It's all a distraction. We know he watches, not falling for it. Good try. It's what you do. And at this point, it's not going to work. We'll talk about it, but we're not going to be distracted.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.